Now, of course, we are going into our next guest, which I explained before is the Chief Science Advisor to the Ministry for Primary Industries and one of Joel's fellow Irishmen. John Roche joins us now. John, I have to say that because Joel got very excited when he was talking to you when he was checking the connection there. He hadn't heard an Irish accent for a while.
Well, that's fantastic. Kia ora, Sarah, and Diagwit, Joel.
Hiya. I haven't heard that in a while.
Oh dear, they're talking in another language. Wonderful, wonderful. Now, John, we have a series of questions to get through, so we'll cut straight to the chase. A few came
Fantastic.
in last Thursday too. Of course, we had the head of the Bovis eradication, Stuart Anderson, on, and of course, he's only been in the seat a week or so, so unfair to throw some very technical scientific questions to him, of course, of what you can handle. Now, first question. This person would like you to explain to them why we're taking a whole herd eradication approach for a disease that doesn't pose a risk for human health or trade. This seems like a foot and mouth approach for something that is decidedly not foot and mouth. And they would like to know if there's a plan B and how long are we going to stick to plan A to see if it's not working before we move to plan B, especially when we've now exceeded cull estimates from the start of 150,000.
Wow, that's a long question. Well, let me see if I can get through that, Sarah. So, why are we taking a whole herd eradication approach? Well, there's two parts to that. Firstly, why are we taking an eradication approach? And that's because the dairy industry and the beef industry decided 2 years ago that they would like to not have Mycoplasma bovis in the country, and the government partnered with them to eradicate it. There's a number of reasons why they would want that. Firstly, outbreaks of the disease are particularly difficult for farmers and for animals. So there's a strong animal welfare issue here. And having been involved in dairy farming in the United States, I've dealt with Mycoplasmas firsthand and Mycoplasma bovis firsthand. And it is really difficult. An outbreak is very difficult with incurable mastitis, seemingly healthy calves dying overnight, etc. So it's nothing I would wish on anyone. Because of our system of farming, with concentrated calving patterns, increasing stress points in the farming system, outbreaks are likely to be worse in a pasture-based system than they are in other systems overseas. And I suppose, importantly, the disease was not widespread in New Zealand, or our best estimates at the time that the disease was not widespread in New Zealand, and therefore eradication was still feasible. And that was the advice that they got from the technical advisory group. So that's the reason for eradication. The reason for whole herd eradication is, again, twofold. A, we don't have a reliable individual animal test. So we can't go into a herd, test the entire herd, identify the animals that have Mycoplasma bovis, pull them out and cull them, and leave the rest of the herd alone. That's one. And two, the research we have done in New Zealand, and we've probably done more research on Mycoplasma bovis in New Zealand now than anywhere else in the world, but also the research that's been done all over the world shows that if you have Mycoplasma bovis positive animals in the herd, then the vast majority of the herd will be infected. So that's the reason for the whole herd eradication approach. Now, the comment that it's like a foot and mouth approach, anyone, and Joel might be able to comment as well as I on this one, but anyone who spent time in a country trying to eradicate foot and mouth will know that this is nothing like a foot and mouth approach. In a foot and mouth approach, it'd be very similar, actually. You were mentioning COVID, very, very similar to COVID. You lock down the country. So you get out the police, you get out the army, and you stop everybody moving. And then you start testing every herd in the country and narrow in on the herds that actually have foot and mouth, and cull those herds and destroy those animals. So it's very, very different. What we're going through is what we call a phased eradication approach, which means we are literally only putting restrictions on herds that have received animals from herds that have been confirmed to be infected. So that's very, very different to foot and mouth. However, I suppose regarding your point of similarities to foot and mouth, one of the things we've learned from Mycoplasma bovis is, there is a significant lack of compliance with our National Animal Identification and Tracing System, our NAIT system in New Zealand. And that very large numbers of animals move around New Zealand every week. So we have a lot of work to do as animal industries to ensure we could manage a faster moving disease like foot and mouth. And then the other part of the question was if we have a plan B. So let's talk about Plan A for a second, because you mentioned we've culled 150,000 animals, which is just past what the original estimate was. The TAG report in February of last year, so February 2019, basically said to forget about those original estimates, that we had far more information at that stage that we could use to predict going forward. No other country had tried to eradicate Mycoplasma bovis, so we were really we were the first, and it's never easy to be first, but we were making those predictions in a void of knowledge. So the fact that we've just over 150,000 animals now, and the number of herds that we're finding is declining all the time, is actually a positive. The predictions were really, really close, despite a real lack of knowledge. The other thing to say about that is 150,000 animals over 3 years is approximately 1% of the animals that we would cull from the dairy and beef sector over that time anyway. So not wanting to belittle, obviously, the trauma that individual farmers have gone through the process of the response, because, I feel for them. 150,000 animals sounds like a huge amount of animals, but that's because our industries are actually so large. It is only approximately 1% of the animals that we would have culled over that period of time anyway. But Plan A versus Plan B. So firstly, Plan A. Plan A looks to be going really well. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, because we don't get an opportunity to talk about it often enough. So where we do, we try and tell as many people as we can. So we've got a number of measurements that allow us to tell if Plan A is going well or not, Plan A being eradication. So firstly, the phylogenetic analysis, the analysis of the bacteria, still indicates that we had a single incursion. We've only had one incursion. And we are continuing to assess the genetics of the bacteria with every cull. The estimated dissemination rate is below 1. Now, you'll have heard in the COVID updates, Ashley Bloomfield talk about a reproduction rate of the virus. And yesterday or the day before, they announced that the reproduction rate of the virus was below 0.5. What that means is that in the COVID world, every infected person is infecting less than 0.5 of one person, which means the curve is on the down. We're actually winning the war against the virus on the basis of those measurements. If we take that back to Mycoplasma bovis, we use a slightly different measurement. We also look at reproduction rate, but we look at a slightly different measurement, which is the estimated dissemination rate, which is the number of herds that become infected from infected herds. And as long as that's below 1, then we are actually winning the war on Mycoplasma bovis. That has been declining since the eradication began, and it has been below 1 for quite some time now, and is continuing to decline. So that again gives us confidence that we're winning the war. We're doing more tests continually, and we're finding less positive farms. So again, just like we're seeing with COVID, that indicates that we're winning the war on Mycoplasma bovis. And our operational timeframes have improved. I mean, we've been criticized, and we've deserved some of the criticisms that we've got over the last several years. As I've said in the past, we're the first people to try this, so we're not going off a blueprint. We had to build the plane while we were flying it, and so it's been a difficult time for all involved, and we've certainly got better at doing those. So they're all probably important items to highlight to your listeners.
Thank you so much, John. That was a very thorough explanation and a great long answer. I've just got a couple more, if you wouldn't mind. I know it's a very hard thing to do, but we've got a couple more interviews to fit in as well. In particular, what about the point of that Plan B when we move to accepting that there's always going to be traces of this within, even though they are low transmission rates, that we will have to just get on and manage this disease within, similar to our efforts to eradicate TB?
So our hope is that we won't have to do that. And exactly, our hope obviously is that we won't have to do it with TB either, with an eradication program. The problem, as I've mentioned earlier, with Mycoplasma bovis, is not having a really sensitive test. And so, as it gets lower and lower prevalence in the country, we will need a more sensitive test. And so we have a number of research projects on the go to try and both improve the tests that we're currently using, and they are good tests. I don't want anyone to think that they're not. They are very good tests in the way that we're using them. But as we get to a lower level of prevalence, we will need a more sensitive test, and we've got a lot of research being undertaken currently to develop those tests.
Okay, and just to end on that, one of the very first things that came out, I remember in the very initial, was the speculation that the disease was brought in via imported semen through a unique process that was used on the very first farm it was discovered through a vet. And MPI have continuously denied and refused acknowledgement that the disease has come from semen. I would like your thoughts on that, and why semen is still, of course, allowed to be legally imported into New Zealand.
Sure. Look, it's a great question. I wasn't aware that we had denied that it had come in through semen. Semen is certainly one of the risk pathways that we believe it could have come through, but it is an extremely low risk. There were far greater risks. Obviously, the greatest risk with transmitting Mycoplasma bovis would have been in live animals, but since we had stopped that before this, that was not likely to be the case. But there was, farm machinery, veterinary medicines, germplasm, they were all evaluated as potential risks. And so, germplasm, either semen or embryos, are a risk, but they're an extremely low risk. And to put that in perspective, we've been importing semen for decades now, and this is the first incursion of Mycoplasma bovis that we've ever detected. Now, that's not to say it didn't come in earlier and it was just wiped out naturally. Highly unlikely that that would have happened because of the way we farm. But certainly we've imported an awful lot of semen, and we haven't brought it in the past in that way. Why is it still allowed to be imported? Well, look, we run a risk-based importation system. We are part of the World Trade Organization, and as a trading nation, as a nation probably more dependent on trade than any other nation in the world, we need to stick to the rules of the World Trade Organization, particularly in the turbulent times that we're dealing with right now. We have very strict sanitary and phytosanitary regulations on what we can and cannot deny entry into the country. That is based on a risk approach, and so we undertake a risk evaluation and a risk analysis, and we develop import health standards on the basis of those. We are currently reviewing the import health standards for semen, so we are evaluating that at the moment. But that's the reason why we can't just do a blanket ban and say there will be no semen imported into the country, because we will see an action by other countries that would stop us exporting our goods to them in retaliation.
I said that I don't like throwing guests under the bus, John, but your last parting question is, what was your favourite board game?
My favourite board game? Well, my wife would tell you that I hate board games, partly because I hate to lose. But my favorite board game is probably chess. I'm one of those boring strategy tacticianers.
Of course you are, especially in the role that you're doing as the Chief Science Advisor for MPI. That is Dr. John Roche. And thank you very much for a very thorough explanation of where things are at with the M. bovis eradication. I'm sure, you could talk about where things are at for hours, and I really appreciate you taking the time to give us a snapshot.
This is Sarah's Country.